So now I'll continue introducing a few more mechanics, but I will also start giving my opinion. I mentioned it before, but there are 4 stats instead of the usual 6. If you're familiar with things like Dungeons and Dragons and other old school style RPG, usually you have strength, dexterity, intelligence, constitution, wisdom, and charisma. Here you only have 4: brawn, which is a little bit like strength and constitution, agility, which is more like dexterity, reflexes, wit, intelligence, perception, but also being cunning, and presence, which is more like charisma, dealing with people, understanding how they feel, how they act, and often it's also magic. Stats do not improve. When you level up, there's not a time when your stats get better. Stats you start with are the ones that are going to follow you through the entire game. But you will gain talents, which are like special abilities, things your characters can do, spells, special things that give them some kind of advantage in fights and diplomacy, lets them heal people. Characters don't become overpowered, they become more resourceful. So you're not gonna be like a tank that can get like 5 crossbow bolts shot at them and still be standing and fine. But you're gonna get better because you're gonna have more options of things you can do that give you an advantage in various situations. So some talents will still make you more survivable. One of the classic ones is Bulwark, which gives you a little pool you roll. If you were gonna get seriously injured, instead you roll that pool. It's 3 dice, but if at some point you roll the pool and it goes to 0, well, you still get severely wounded. Something really neat about talents is that they can be taken from any class. You're meant to make it fit. You can kind of change the understanding of the talent, kind of say, well, I can now have this bulwark because I bought some armor. You should make it fit, but can choose from any classes. So it's really not restrictive. I have an example of refashioning a talent like that. So the half-orc female, in her background, she was an herbalist. I gave her healing hands, which is from monk, but it would fit. Basically, instead of using her hands, she could use her herbs. Talents can do all sorts of things, but something that's pretty common is adding +1 dice to rolls or ignoring the difficulty of something. So it allows you to more easily do things that are really impressive. Example, in the ranger class, lets you shoot someone from cover or from very far away with no added thorns. So what's my take about that? Well, I quite like it. I think it makes characters more realistic, and combat is always deadly. You don't have to constantly readjust to how like OP the party of characters I've gotten. As the GM in other games, usually you constantly have to adjust. Oh, they have this new ability. No, here combat is always deadly, always dangerous, but characters can get very unlucky and die. So I'm sure groups that use Grimwild will put house rules on this. My campaign ended very abruptly and brutally when I lost during a boss battle. As you can see here, in just the space of a few rolls, everyone that was still there died, basically. I had 3 characters die, including my main character. My hunter got a disaster. He was already severely wounded, so he had to roll to see if he was dead, and he was dead. Then a few rolls later, my barbarian is fighting the boss. It's a giant spider woman with magic spells. He gets bloodied for a second time. Since he's a berserker, he gets another action, but he has to do a death roll, and he fails it and he dies as well. And then the paladin, he tries an epic move where he basically jumps and tries to strike the giant spider woman dead. But what does he get? He gets a Grim, he gets bloodied for the second time, gets a death roll, and dies. Every time I did a roll, which was always on 2 dice and taking the best one, I always got Grim, so that's it. Groups are not gonna enjoy that. They're gonna say, no, we're gonna give you a little bit more of a chance. Because, I mean, I was 4th level, so that's a lot of sessions to just die like that. So, another notable thing is that there's no armor or armor class. So, in many conventional RPG games, usually you will try to hit someone. If that person has more or less armor, it's gonna be more or less easy to hit them. In this game, that's not how it works. When someone gets damaged through an action roll, failed defense roll, etc., an impact move against the players, they just get the damage. So again, if you have a talent like Bulwark, you'll still have an advantage because you have this little pool of health that is there regenerating each session that prevents you from getting damage. But still, it's not like armor. What do you think about that? Well, I think it's for the best. Personally, I really like it. Take it streamlines combat and prevents armor from being OP. In some other games, people with a really heavy armor are super annoying to hit. Your odds of hitting them are super low. So here, no one has armor, so combat is quick and deadly. Armor is basically something to roleplay with, but not something that has an in-game mechanic as such, except if you take the few talents and abilities that kind of simulate armor. I say that no one has armor. Well, if you have a boss, you can still make them invulnerable to certain types of damage. You can require them to be hit in their weaknesses. Now we're at the really big section. I'm gonna talk about HP and damage in general. There's no hit points in this game. It's all replaced by marks, which is a low form of damage, bloodied, which is a serious type of damage, rattled, which is a mental type of damage. It's like trauma or fear, vex, which is a more immediate kind of fear that doesn't last very long, and conditions, which is something like poison, broken arm, damage that lingers and that impacts your role playing. Let's talk about marks first. So, when you get a minor form of damage, you will take a mark to a stat that the GM chooses. So, let's say the rogue gets messy on a pickpocket roll, the guard turns around and punches them in the face. Brawn is marked as a result. Brawn is an easy way to represent when you take physical damage. When you get that mark, it's like a little dot under your stat. The next time you roll that stat, so action roll, defense roll, you will have +1 torn, so a negative d8. After you roll that stat, the mark disappears, or it could disappear if you take just even a short rest. As an example, people that are familiar with my content will know this location well. It was in the Spellspire Castle. We cut to the morning. 2 towers are in frame. One is made of icy white stone while the other is made of red bricks. They are far away. Our adventurers think nothing of it, but suddenly Lorm and Albus are targeted by these enchanted sentinels. Albus has a firebolt targeting him, while Lorm takes a flying shard of ice. I had the hunter roll a agility defense roll, and Lorm, since he's not very agile, I'll let him do a brawn, so basically just tanking the hit. The hunter got a critical, so he got out of the way. But the orc got messy, so instead of having him severely wounded, I decided he would get a mark. What do I think about marks? When you're first introduced to them, they look like a transient form of damage. They don't look that bad. You may even think your players got off easy if they only got a mark, but they can be really deadly because getting even just 1 torn on a roll can really get you into bad territory. If you're unlucky, your Grim becomes a disaster and then you're in a world of trouble. Here's an example of that. This is leading up to when my whole party was killed at the end of my adventure. Cut to the boss fight. they didn't have time to rest. The hunter attempts to shoot one of the drows that are pouring through the door, does his agility roll with +1 thorn, and what do you know? A Grim becomes a disaster. He's already severely wounded, so he's already bloodied. He rolls to see what happens, and he dies. That's how he died. So marks are no joke. They could literally get you dead. So now let's talk about more severe wounds, bloodied and rattled. Bloodied is for wounds to brawn and agility. Rattled is for wounds to wit and presence. A character is like mentally drained if you get rattled. When you have one of these, you have +1 thorn on every roll. If you're both bloodied and rattled, you have 2 thorns on everything. Insane danger. However, don't forget, because this is something I forgot a couple times when playing, if you have something marked, let's say brawn is marked, and then you get bloodied, well, you only add 1 thorn. So if they're in the same category, they don't stack. But if, for example, your character is bloodied and presence is marked, and then you want to do a presence roll, well, you would get the mark from presence since it's in the register of rattled, and you would get the mark from bloodied. But if you tried doing anything else, let's say if you did a brawn roll, you would only get the thorn from bloodied. Or even if you wanted to do a wits roll, wits is not marked in this scenario, so you only get the 1 thorn. I want to mention also, in my last example, when the hunter was bloodied and also had a mark, he was still on 1 thorn, as you could see. But even 1 thorn got him killed. My take is that bloodied and rattled make characters very fragile. If a character gets a second bloodied or rattled, they go down. And then you have to roll to see if they die, if they get a long-term condition, or if they're just fine. If you get a perfect on a 6, then they're just kind of knocked out. If you go into combat with one of these arms, it's a huge gamble. And when I took that gamble, I lost a bunch of characters most of the time. Sometimes I got away with it, especially if you have like a couple characters that are harmed, but you still have like your big strong characters that are fine. You can get away with it. The wounded ones lay low while the other ones take all the spotlight. Overall, I like that it makes combat dramatic and high stakes, but parties with no healers will probably need to escape from dungeons pretty regularly. People that like grimdark, that like gritty role-playing will probably welcome that it's really high stakes, but I bet most groups will just say you have a couple times you can get a grim, we'll put a mark on your character. When you get to 2 or 3 in the whole campaign, then you're really dead. So I have a little example from my role-playing. This was the first death in my adventure. It was also in the castle. They were fighting spiders and one of those priestess summoners. Although the 2 men fight as best as they can, the spiders are restless. The priestess cackles, then she throws a fireball at Rorm, the orc, the main character. Camellia, who was in love with him, seeing he's being targeted, tries to push him out of the way. She doesn't care, she's bloodied. She's like, I'm gonna save him, which was very in her character. She would have gotten a spark for it. Basically, she added 1 dice to his roll, made it like a team effort to evade the projectile. But they got a grim, so the highest result was like a 2 or 3. They both got bloodied. The orc was fine before, he got bloodied, okay. But the half-orc, Camellia, she freaking took it and died. It was pretty good for role-playing. The orc was pissed, became super dark, vengeful. He wanted his revenge on the whole dark elf kind. But I lost one of my favorite characters at that moment. To wrap this up, we're gonna cover the other types of damage, starting with Vex, which is a lower form of Rattled. It's like a fight or flight response. You decide based on roleplay if they're gonna fight, run away, freak out, freeze. If you need to roll straight after that, you have a Thorn added to the roll. I kind of like Vex. didn't occur very often. If you remember, it occurred when Camellia almost fell off the cliff when that guy had her on his shoulder. She got vexed when she got out of there. It's not very dangerous. It doesn't even take a full scene to clear. It happens, a few actions occur around that character, and then they're fine. It's mostly for role playing, basically. Then conditions. Conditions are pretty neat. They're like a pool, usually. You have different types of conditions. A broken bone would be long term. A hate for kobolds could be permanent. Poison could be urgent or short term. Bleeding out, probably urgent, so it heightens the drama. Could be something that you have to roll as a pool to see if you can shake it off by yourself. Most of the times, conditions will occur when you get dropped. So let's say you're bloodied and bloodied a second time. You roll your story roll to see if you die. You get lucky, you get a messy. Usually that will be a condition that you and the GM figure out together. Conditions always have an impact on role playing, and it can add +1 torn depending on what it is. So obviously, if you have a broken foot, it's going to be really hard to climb a cliff. So sometimes you will get into situations where things you were allowed to do before can't be done. There's this rule that if you're attempting to do something and it would be 3 turns of difficulty, so something really tough, like shooting someone from very far away or in almost complete cover, that might be impossible for a normal person. Only people that are extremely skilled may be able to do that. But in this case, maybe just shooting your bow kind of far at someone that's not really in cover, maybe because you're wounded with a condition somehow, then you couldn't even do that. So what's my take? Well, I quite like conditions. Usually they're expressed as pools, as I said. So they're great at heightening the tension, or usually they make your character think outside the box more. They're wounded somehow, so they need to do something. But GM, please use with caution because they can be devastating. They can really cripple you. My example is when the knight, he got bit by a poisonous snake and his leg got paralyzed. So at first there was a delay for the venom to set in. There was a pull for that. Once the pull was depleted, he got paralyzed, couldn't move. And then I started a long-term pull for just the venom clearing out, him regaining his legs. And it actually lasted about a session and a half before he could walk again. So he had to go through a ton of things. I mean, we had a donkey with us, so he was just riding on the donkey, unable to do anything physical. So don't abuse this feature, please. If you're the game master, your players will not find it funny if they're stuck not being able to do anything for more than a session. But here's a little note of advice. If I was to make death rolls a little bit less rough, I would probably offer my players, at least the first time you quote unquote die, instead you get a permanent condition. And it could be something pretty grisly if the player is okay with it. Let's say you get like a giant sword slashes you, you fall, you get a grim. Well, maybe now you lost an arm. Really tough condition is gonna make your character less efficient, but you get to keep the character. Something to keep in mind. I think I'll probably implement it in my next adventure. Now we move on from the damage. Classes and backgrounds. So that part is pretty much a crowd pleaser. You get all your classic D&D classes. I think you have something like 12 or 14. You know, you have your berserkers, warriors, druids, sorcerers, wizards, rogues, bards. You even have like a scion in the full version of the rules, like psionic abilities. Basic core classes you get from other RPGs, you have them. The way they work, usually you have a core talent that will get upgraded every once in a while. So like on level 3, you'll get more uses out of your talent. So if you're a sorcerer, it'll let you cast more spells, more varieties of spells. If you're a berserker, you can go into your rage more often. As I mentioned before, it's very modular, so you can mix and match secondary talents from other classes. My take is that I like that there's not a lot of restrictions. If you've done something like Dungeons and Dragons for a while, you know that certain players will always approach you to try to have something a little bit custom. Well, in those rules, they're already accommodated. Multi-classing is not a thing. Everyone can multi-class with no problem. And a bonus with this is that you can easily take this system and instead of playing fantasy, medieval, you can play modern. You can play sci-fi space opera. You can play antiquity role-playing. It makes it very easy to reinterpret. A note about the classes, which are very similar to other games. To me, they feel like they should. I feel like the Ranger felt good. The Berserker is the one I tried the most. To me, it felt like a proper Berserker. Now we move on to enemies and impact moves in combat. Why impact moves specifically in combat? Because combat is a huge draw for me in this system. I think it's probably my favorite combat system. Enemies. There's multiple types. You have mooks, the very low of the low, easy to kill. You can kill a bunch in one action roll. You have tough enemies. You have to really focus on them one-on-one to have a chance at them. You have elites. Just by themselves, they take a full pull. So maybe you have a Minotaur and he's 6G pull, that's his health. And you have bosses. Usually they have multiple pulls. They can do all sorts of actions. They're really strong. And yet they're quite easy to come up with. So what's great with this system, the enemies are super easy to make up on the spot. It's only a boss that'll take you a few more minutes than usual, but it still won't take you nearly as long as making up enemies in other systems. So in the full version of the rules, they add a little layer called tactics. Could have like a goblin skirmisher that, well, it'll try to attack and then retreat. Or a lion predator. Predator would be the tactic. So he will try to ambush and then pursue his prey. So as I said, I love that. Makes things super easy. I'm playing solo. I run into a combat. Quickly just decide, okay, this type of enemy, that type of enemy. Attribute some health pools or numbers, and then I tack on a tactic to them, and I'm set. It takes seconds, it takes a minute, and that's it. But as you can see, monsters are basically name, tactic, and then what they are, the health pool when they're elites are 6G cultists. Well, they're all mooks, and they're a pool, but they're marauders. And the Drider, he has a pool in himself because he's an elite. Some people will have more trouble with that because you have to go by feel. You have to kind of learn how many enemies you can get away with. It's not going to be the same depending on the group you're running. So if you're a GM that's like 10 years into Dungeons and Dragons, that does all the math, that has all the little widgets and apps to do it easily, maybe for those specific people, they won't like it as much. So now more about combat. Remember, impact moves occur mostly when players do an action roll or a defense roll, and they get grim or messy. So that's usually when a GM will activate their minions. It's like a reaction you do when players try something dangerous. It's great for the GM. It gives you a lot of options. It's not turn by turn, it's not on a timer. In other games, you have initiative or you have a turn. Usually it's all the players and then all the monsters if it's turn by turn. So your players arrive, they attack, kill a bunch of them, and you hope you have enough to attack them in return. And then you have to judge, did I put enough? Or did they kill too few and now they're in trouble? It's kind of predictable, usually. Well, not in this game. It's almost as if the monsters attack in the player's turn. Since there's a ton of impact moves that are available and they're all kind of vague and they can encompass a lot of different things, you get so many options and you get to narrate all sorts of cool actions. I want to share with you a pretty cool little moment of combat I had in the castle. The marksman, that's one of the dark elves, attempts to shoot her crossbow at Sir Peter. He does a defense roll and he gets messy, so he gets a little bit wounded. The shot lodges himself in his armpit. Although it does not penetrate, it hinders his movements. The knight riposted with the point attack, and he got a grim, so got a bad wound, but hey, he has bulwark, so didn't even drop a single point of his armor. The marksman manages to dodge and smash the knight in the side with her crossbow before moving out in the hallway. So I allowed the marksman to kind of move a little bit at the same time. Camellia throws her dagger at the drow, but it's messy, so I countered it. Decided, okay, it only hits with the guard, so the drow stumbles forward a bit. Then Albus, the hunter, takes advantage of that, and he shoots at the drow, but he was marked, I believe, got a messy, and I decided this time to not take an impact move and use it for something else. So, okay, that marksman got killed. But, hearing what happened, the other drow, which was one with a shield and a sword, she goes into a fury and she attacks both men. So I had them both roll a defense roll. The orc got messy, so he got a mark. And the knight, Sir Peter, got bloodied, so he had to roll again on his armor. He was lucky, he didn't take damage. The hits rain upon the two men and they are feeling bruised and winded. "Let's get this over with," yells Lorm in a commanding voice before he lunges at the woman, trying to slam her to the ground without killing her. It was a brawn roll, added 1 from Spark, but since he didn't want to kill her, I put +2 thorns. It got his roll to a grim, but instead of getting him wounded, I decided that he didn't manage to keep her alive and she died. So he did not get to interrogate her. So overall, it prevents a waste of time from making tons of attacks for all those little enemies. You don't have to micromanage. And it forces the GM to make decisions. Let's say a warrior just had a messy on his charge. He says, I'm going to charge those people and I'm going to attack them. He rolls for brawn, messy. But it still means that he partially succeeded, even though you get an impact roll. The Game Master tolls with some options in his head. 1, maybe the warrior gets to defeat an enemy, but they get wounded back. This would be hit them hard. Or maybe he just fails his attack. Maybe he moves there, but no one gets wounded. That would be a counter. Or maybe he executes his charge and he kills an enemy, but you keep the impact move in your pocket and you decide, I'm gonna get someone else to activate using that. It's super creative. You will not get bored with this combat system. Players often get to attack first, but that does not mean enemies will activate last. Players may get a lucky streak of perfect or critical rolls, but even just a roll of a 5 will allow the GM to activate. Because of this, I find this system more fair, dramatic, and tense than most of the RPGs I have tried before. Players aren't just rolling attacks, they put themselves in danger to change the course of the battle, but when they fail, on a grim, disaster, or a half fail on a messy, the consequences are very real. Also, it's more fun for the GM since they have rules to abide by, and when you have rules to abide by, the players can't give you shit. So you'll just say, well, that's the rules, we're playing the game, that's how it's designed. As a GM, you don't have to hesitate as much to giving them consequences, to giving them the bloody, to giving them the mark. All part of this give and take game you're playing. So yeah, I find this game a lot more interactive. As the GM, you're not outside of the rules, kind of arbitrarily judging what's going to happen and having this godlike role. No, you're just playing the enemies and you're helping in the story, of course. But you are also playing a game. That's the point. Now, for the final slide of the review. This is the part where I will mention a bunch of little mechanics just so you have a little bit of an idea about them. I call this section a cinematic system, a few words on other features. I say cinematic system because that's how this RPG builds itself. If you read the intro, they'll say, think cinematically. Think as if you're all in a movie and trying to make it a movie. It's not a sandbox, it's not a simulator, it's not a paper video game. So they encourage you to say things like, the camera zooms on his face, the camera cuts away there, the spotlight arrives on your player. Cinematic terms that talk to people's imagination. There's montage sequences. Everyone rolls 2d6s and they describe a bit of what they're doing during a sequence. It's a very quick and easy way of fast forwarding through things that are a little bit boring. So, travel between locations, for example, setting camp, searching a library. Everyone rolls dice. When there's a grim, something not good happened. And maybe you can make a little bit of a scene out of it, but you get a basic sense of how successful they are at whatever scene you're fast forwarding through. For example, I had a ton of montage rolls in my adventure. Here's just one of them that was kind of cute. I was seeing if they would find an encounter on the road, and when they got a critical, I decided, you know what, it's gonna be a tavern, the Merry Goblin Inn. Didn't want to spend too much time on it, so I decided it was a montage. Everyone started by rolling 2 dice, and then to explain the result they get, they have to describe what is occurring. On the 3rd day of travel, our adventurers are pleasantly surprised when they arrive at the Merry Goblin, a small tavern with stables and a handful of adventurers near a small village. They rent 2 rooms, and Camellia jumps on the occasion to take a nap. Meanwhile, Lorm decides to unwind in his own way by drinking. Albus and Sir Peter attempt to be a bit more productive during that time. Together, they try to chat with the few other patrons of the place. Although Sir Darkmoor can't find anything from talking with the merchants, Lorm and Albus are luckier. An adventurer finds the courage to drink with the imposing orc, and the discussion shifts to Spellspire. Between drinks, the burly man wearing a chainmail explains that the place has been abandoned for a while and is dangerous enough to still be full of useful or perhaps cursed items. He also takes a moment of silence when he reminds himself that one of his friends disappeared a few years ago, trying to explore that location. Meanwhile, Albus has an interesting conversation with a farmer that is bringing part of his lord's tribute to the capital. The farmer explains that more activity has been noticed around Spellspire than usual. People report seeing large spiders in the countryside and flashes of light coming from the windows. In my case, it gave me information about the location I was traveling to, so you're not completely skipping a scene, you're just making it condensed, quick and easy. You also have story arcs, which are something each player have. It's like a little goal for them, usually a role-playing opportunity. If they get their goal done, they get spark. You also have tangles, which is when you make a tough decision or place yourself in trouble to stay true to your character. You're also rewarded with spark. Bonds, which is just a little thing on your character sheet that tells what are your relationships to the other characters in your group. This is really cool. They're supposed to evolve through the campaign. Basically, it's what enables like romance, rivalry. It can fuel quarrels between players. It's just like a live status of how good the relationship is between the different adventurers. It's really just for roleplay, but if you do change a bond, like if your character views someone else differently in a good or a bad way, well, that other person that made you change your outlook will get 1 spark. There are teamwork mechanics. Players can help each other on rolls, but if they get bad consequences, all the participants are affected. When you help someone, you can add 1 of your dice to his roll, which is very helpful. There was an example when Camellia tried to push Lorm out of the way. In that scenario, it backfired. Usually, it's not that bad. When you have a character that is wounded, assisting other characters can help mitigate the effects of thorns. Because I read the rules, I don't think you add your thorns when you help someone. So let's say you have a fighter character, he wants to help another fighter character, but he's very wounded. The first fighter character already has a ton of dice he's gonna throw. Okay, I'm gonna help him do his attack. Adds 1 die, and the chances something will backfire are a lot lower than if he just did the action by himself. Potency is a keyword you will encounter in the rules. It's basically something you get from talents, and it lets a player ignore all thorns from very difficult tasks. For example, a bard uses the Bard Song talent. He has potency on his presence roll and attempts to put a whole group of orcs to sleep with a lullaby. The roll would normally be impossible. Since it's a whole group, you would probably put 3 thorns. Orcs are not very gentle or calm. But since he has potency, he can attempt it with 0 thorns. So makes it way easy. Like, it's really unlikely it will backfire when you have potency. And makes you able to do awesome things. Quarrels are something I talked about before. So they're like a montage roll for arguments. Everyone rolls 2d6s and the best result wins. And either way, everyone who participated, since it's like a good sequence of roleplay, they get 1 spark. Here's another example of a quarrel. It was early in the adventure. There was a big 50-meter gap between 2 hills. Many members of the group didn't want to cross it. Camellia, the half-orc, she was ready to cross it, and she wanted to convince Albus, the hunter, to go with her, because he's good at agility, he's just not brave. But she wanted Lorm, the orc, to not try to cross it, because he's very bad at agility. I decided to do a sort of 2-way quarrel, which is a little bit of house ruling. The orc got the best result, so he didn't get convinced. Then Camellia had the second best, and the hunter had the worst one. So I decided she convinced the hunter, but not the orc. First, Camellia crossed, she was fine. Then the hunter crossed, he was fine. And then the orc, while the other 2 are on the other side, he's like, I'm gonna cross anyway. And thank God he was fine as well. Very briefly, magic spells. Magic is very freeform, just like combat is. It's mostly up to players to invent spells based on simple rules specific to magical classes. The spells are not strictly for support or offense. There's examples in the rules, but let's say you have a web spell. Well, maybe you can cast it on enemies to get them tangled, or you can cast it under someone who's falling to break their fall. Magic is not something I explored a lot. I only explored it a little bit through Bard Magic, but it's really fun. Basically, there's 4 categories of spells. You have cantrips, very small spells that are more like for role-playing, like a basic spell and a potent spell. Basic spell is almost like an action, while a potent spell is like something you do with a potency, so you can do something awesome with it. 4th category is a ritual, which I cover just below, which is basically super complicated magic that takes probably multiple sessions to set up. If you can do it, you can do the action roll, gather everything you need, do all the role playing. Well, you can do pretty much anything that you can decide between you and the game master. And of course, like in any good fantasy system, there are rules for treasure and arcana. I won't go into depth about them. Basically, it's the kind of system where you don't need to track every single coin. Maybe if you're playing some kind of survival setting, you could have a pool to track your survival supplies. But in general, you won't have like individual pieces of gold listed, individual treasures. It's going to be like a big category. So there's rules to manage that. And magical items, they're a bit like in any kind of roleplay. But the notable thing is how they use pools to manage a number of activations. So if you're really lucky, you'll get more activations than you thought if you roll a bunch of 5s and 6s and 4s every time you use the magical item. Or if you're very unlucky, you'll use it once and then it'll be completely empty. So the pros and cons. Who is this for and who would definitely not enjoy this? So this system is great at encouraging storytelling.